I'm sure your news feeds have been inundated with news and points of views around the Facebook and LinkedIn user data dumps. Now, Facebook has reiterated that the security gap was fixed many months ago, and actually, the data dump is not as fresh. And then there's Clubhouse. The Clubhouse API allows access to user data, which was justified as a by design feature by Clubhouse. Now, I think we can explain almost everything away, but more and more these explanations sound like excuses. What do we need to do to drive outcomes and not excuses? And I think one plausible answer here is that we need to have a security program that treats security as an infinite game. An infinite game, as described by one of my favorite authors, Simon Sinek, is a game in which the players keep changing, the rules keep changing, and there is no defined endpoint. There are no winners, there are no losers in an infinite game. There's only ahead and behind. Today, I'll chat with Cindi Carter, someone who's been instrumental in shaping my thinking about how to get AppSec right. And with her, I hope to explore this idea of AppSec being an infinite game, where the players keep changing. There are new app teams, new DevOps teams, new security teams. Where the rules keep changing, there are new apps that are deployed, the threat landscape keeps evolving. Where there is no defined endpoint, now business needs keep changing almost every day. Where we are driving outcomes and not excuses, and where culture, team, and program form the bedrock of good AppSec. But first, let's do a deep dive into this month's application security statistics and see how the state of application security is shaping up so far this year.
Welcome to White Hat Security's AppSec Stats Flash, the monthly podcast on the state of application security. Hosted by Setu Kulkarni with analysis from White Hat's in-house security expert, Zach Jones. Today's special guest is Cindi Carter, a global security executive and founding president of Women in Security in Kansas City.
Let's start with the customary window of exposure data. The significance of measuring window of exposure was amply highlighted, in my opinion, in the past few weeks. I want to remind all of us about the news that came out of SAP in the last couple of weeks. ZNet reported that SAP applications are used by an estimated 400,000 enterprise organizations worldwide, almost 500,000. That's a huge number. And roughly 1,500 SAP application-related attack attempts were tracked between June 2020 and March 2021, of which at least 300 were successful. Now, one of the most critical vulnerabilities tracked as a CVE is a vulnerability in an application called Solman, which is a centralized SAP administration application. And it is issues like these that need to be found and fixed in the first place, because once SAP is implemented by a customer, there is evidently no budget or resource available to go back and patch the implementation to fix the vulnerability. My view is that this is just a sign of things to come, especially since this is a one-step removed kind of problem. The ISV, in this case SAP, produce software that its customers have implemented. There's a big gray zone between the ISV producing the software and it being implemented and used in production. And this big gray zone is months of implementation time, scores of external consultants who are brought on board to implement the package, and arguably the lack of oversight and accountability once the implementation is complete and is in production. So with that word of caution, let's look at some other window of exposure trends. As you may all remember, we've been tracking manufacturing as the ignominious leader in the window of exposure leaderboard. However, this month's data shows that public administration is now more vulnerable than manufacturing as an industry. We find that 71% of applications in the public administration space now have a window of exposure of a full year. What that means is that 71% of the applications in public administration have at least one serious exploitable vulnerability open throughout the year. Now, could it be the fact that we're now exactly at the 1 year mark when everything was shut down and we went virtual? Is it that public administration applications suddenly became the only way to do business with the state and local authorities? And that more applications were brought online than ever before in the public administration space? Let me get in Zach at this point so that he can share his view on what could be some of the underlying trends and reasons for why we've seen this shift with public administration becoming the most vulnerable space.
I think it's interesting if we look at not only public administration, but the group of industries who historically have not been online as their primary business relative to the group of industries who have a longer history of being online as at least their a main part of their business, if not their primary business. And if we look at the window of exposure data today for this month, in comparison to window of exposure data that we released in the first AppSec stats flash, or even the yearly window of exposure data that White Hat has put out over the years, it's interesting to see that that group that has more experience being online is seeing relative improvement, and the group that has less experience being online is seeing some negative trends in terms of an increasing window of exposure. Now, overall, the windows of exposure magnitude across all industries is not seeing a drastic change, but security and application security being a competitive game means that those industries that are trending towards being the leaders, the negative leaders in window of exposure, are the ones who now are going to start to see much more incidents and impacts against their business as a result of their relative posture compared to other industries.
Now, let's dig on that a little bit more. Is it the case that industries like public administration, which we're kind of talking about today, is it the case that they already had web applications that were primarily meant for internal use? For example, you went to the DMV and you spoke to someone, and that someone was using a web application to get the job done. Is it that those very applications that were in the first place designed for kind of internal or operator use are now being transformed? You create a API layer, create a nice user experience, and bring it out as an online application while the bones and the skeleton still remain the same. Is it that which is causing the window of exposure to be highlighted?
So I certainly have an anecdotal example of that being the case. So interesting that you asked that question. My local county, actually, I had found a place on their website where suddenly there was an access portal for their employees to have remote access that was not particularly well protected. So certainly that could be some of the case. That's just one example. But I think now that we're past the year mark, we're also seeing an opportunity for purpose-built applications to serve these new needs coming online, right? It was unlikely that 3 months in or so that you would see brand new purpose-built applications. But after a year, certainly some of these industries have had the impetus to really make a meaningful effort towards a permanent change in their online presence. So I think it's probably a mix of both, right? Initially, some trying to fast pivot to enable the shutdown to not shut you down, right? And now potentially it's, okay, we've decided that we need to have this permanent digital presence, and we've employed internal developers or pursued contract development to build these applications, and those are starting to come online. And those organizations may not have application security practice really experience and in the forefront of their mind. So when we start to scan these applications in production, we're starting to see that they contain a number of vulnerabilities, and that the time it takes these organizations to remediate those vulnerabilities is pretty long.
Right. And what's interesting is, as you start thinking about these vulnerabilities, what we are finding is that the top 5 vulnerability classes have remained relatively static, right? There are information leakage, insufficient transport level protection, insufficient session expiration, cross-site scripting, and content spoofing. These are the top vulnerabilities that we've been tracking for quite a long time. Now, is there a silver lining here? I think there is. How cool would it be if we could, let's say, start a year-long campaign to quote unquote vaccinate our applications against these known vulnerability types. It's not like we don't know what these issues are. In fact, we've known these issues for a while now. I think we should cover kind of this idea of starting a targeted campaign in greater depth in one of our next episodes, Zach. But for now, let's kind of try and pivot to an interesting topic that we've been tracking over the last few months, right? How does OWASP Top 10 feature into our findings? You and I have been, dare I say, trying to reinterpret the OWASP Top 10 based on the data that we've been analyzing on a monthly basis. Now, we did a deep dive on A6, which was security misconfiguration in February. We then took the next most prevalent OWASP Top 10 class, which was A3 sensitive data exposure last month. And this month, we're looking at the next most prevalent OWASP Top 10 class, which is broken access control. So, Zach, before we kind of dig into this topic, help me get a good definition of broken access control. What is it? And as usual, what constitutes broken access control and how does it manifest itself in production?
Sure. So broken access control is a class whereby a user is able to or is granted access to data or a resource or a functionality of the application that when you analyze what the use cases of the application and the user privileges should be from a logical perspective, that user shouldn't be able to do that thing. So one of the core words there is should, and it's an interesting problem in detection with understanding when you detect that a certain functionality is available either unauthenticated or across users, whether or not that is something that should exist. So for example, if whenever I'm navigating the website, I find that there is a URL that contains my bank account number, and then I decide to maybe change that number by 1. If that number, that new account number is not an account that I own, it's pretty obvious to a human being that I shouldn't be able to see the details of that account. And then similarly, as an example, if a administration interface is available over the internet, for those admins to remote in, does it enforce that you need to be an admin or that you actually need to be authenticated to the site at all? Those are the sort of issues that we're talking about when we talk about broken access control.
Got it. Before we kind of tear this apart a little bit more, what you're saying is that access control, while the implementation is technical and technological in nature, the definition of access control is more kind of business logic driven, right? It's how do you want the application to work? And the point I'm trying to make here is in testing for broken access control, there seem to be limitations of technology, right? Scanners may not actually be able to test all access control issues because scanners by themselves do not understand what the intended business logic is supposed to be. Is that a fair statement, Zach?
That's correct. You need some sort of an oracle to tell your assessment technology, if it is automated, right, what the constraints of access should be according to the business logic, like you mentioned. And from a traditional, scanning a website perspective, if you're treating all websites as just general forms that you access through the user interface, you can't always answer those questions about which things should and should not happen. As a human, you can, but as an automated tool, there's certainly more analysis and information that needs to feed inputs to allow it to make those decisions.
I think that's a key takeaway, right, for us and for the audience today. As you start thinking about access control and this particular OWASP Top 10 vulnerability class called broken access control, the solution is certainly in scanning technology to a certain extent, but then continue to think about the business logic and the implication of business logic that is defined by product managers, by people who design the business application. So there is an opportunity here to think about access control issues by bringing in the right subject matter experts who understand how the applications work.
Yeah, you said it. The key word is design, right? This has to be defined at design time, and that makes it much easier to validate. You may not even need a traditional security scanner to validate it at that point, because it becomes a functional requirement. User A should, and user B should not. And that's something that a functional test or an end-to-end integration test can validate as a part of your requirement, because otherwise it's not a bug unless it's defined, right? So you may have functionality that's doing more than its design, and that's okay unless you specify the functionality should only do X.
Good point. And I'm going to go back into my experience a little bit as a product manager. When I used to be a product manager defining product features and functionality, I must confess, Zach, I never thought about access control. Access control was actually an afterthought from my perspective, right? We would write user stories. Yes, we would create some user stories around role-based access control, but it was again an afterthought. I think one of the things that we need to kind of put a pin in and explore again in a future episode is the role of product management and security. And maybe one of the things that we have to outline from a job description perspective for a security product manager is focus on access control. That has to be one of those things that they do in defining the functionality of the product. Now, let's move on a little bit here and take a deeper dive into broken access control. I understand that broken access control is not a very broad classification, but still there are a couple of different vulnerability types that constitute broken access control. What are those 2 or 3 top vulnerability types that make up broken access control from the data that we have, Zach?
So at White Hat, the 3 vulnerability classes that constitute broken access control are insufficient authorization, which is the most common, insufficient process validation, and then insecure indexing. Those 3 are sort of a little bit broad classes, but those wrap up under broken access control.
Insufficient authorization, I think the name gives it away. This is where end users have or users have access to resources they shouldn't. Is that fair to say?
That's correct. And that can be due to the design of sort of the back end of the application. So cases where I change a bank account number on a URL or, some other identifying feature in an HTTP request, and that allows me to view another user's access or escalate my privileges. But it also includes flaws on the client side where the appropriate protections are not being put in place to prevent things like a malicious website in one tab from reading the potentially sensitive information that could exist on a website in another tab or in an iframe or something like that.
And how frequent is that? Because I can tell you that our browsing behaviors are such that we have multiple tabs open at any given point in time.
So it's definitely a common flaw that websites don't adequately use the security controls that the browsers provide. So one example of that is the browser controls around cross-origin resource sharing. And out of our data pile of insufficient authorization detections at White Hat, 66% of those are related to lack of appropriate cross-origin resource sharing controls. From an attack perspective, it's also a very common technique to use. It's one of the primary reasons why us as consumers end up seeing various types of unsolicited emails and text messages trying to get us to click on links, right? They're trying to take us to malicious websites that try a variety of different techniques, but this is one of them, right? Attempting to see what are you logged into in your browser? What other sites? Are you logged into your bank? Are you logged into your social media accounts? And are those sites protecting themselves appropriately to prevent that site from having some snippet of JavaScript that can read data across the different domains that you have open and potentially are logged into?
66% is a large number though, Zach. I actually think maybe this is another key takeaway from the conversation today. Cross-origin resource sharing is an issue that listeners should pay attention to, and maybe an opportunity here to create some training and education around how to identify these issues and how to fix them along the way in your application security program.
Absolutely. We've talked before about these issues that fall into a gray area between, is it something that should exist to protect the application in its code, or is it something that should exist to protect the application through some sort of infrastructural controls that are put in place in the operation of the application. And this is yet another example of that kind of issue that you can solve in either place. So perhaps there's a little bit of a gray area about who's the last say on how to put these controls in place.
Absolutely. My view is that we should overcompensate, at least from an education perspective. Let's get the dev team and the ops team and the security team all equally educated, so all of them together can actually make an informed decision on whose responsibility it is to fix the application, given the business context in which the application is running. Now, there is another vulnerability type here called insufficient process validation. I do want to spend a minute digging into that. Insufficient process validation, by the name of it, it sounds like this is more related to the business logic of the application, the sequence in which resources from an application are accessed and manipulated. That sequence determines whether there is broken access control or not. Why don't you spend a minute talking about that? And also talk about what's the best way to kind of detect these kind of vulnerabilities and what's the best way to potentially prevent these vulnerabilities from occurring in the first place.
Absolutely. So the 100% of the vulnerabilities in this last 1 year of data that composed the insufficient process validation vulnerabilities, which we find occur on approximately 1% of the sites that we test. 100% of those are reported through our business logic assessment. So that's a human engineer looking at what the site does, what is its functionality, what is the business feature that the site is accomplishing, and trying to come up with ways that that business feature could be abused. So an example would be if you're going through a checkout process, right? Is there some way that you could skip the payment step and go straight to submitting the shipping information and sending your order through? Right. And that's a flaw that we've seen a number of times. And we've been able to not only validate that the application itself doesn't stop you from doing that, but that the back-end business processes of actually shipping something out don't stop it either. So that's always an interesting one to find. Another very common canonical example of this is things like negative values and negative quantities, right? If you have a slight technical capability to manipulate the traffic of the site when it leaves your browser and before it ends up going to the actual backend servers, can you change that quantity of 1 to -1 such that the price gets multiplied by the negative quantity and thus the price becomes negative? Or the inverse of that, right? Can you just change the price of something manually to be 0 or to be a negative value to give yourself a 5-finger discount on the items in your shopping cart? So those are some common examples of insufficient process validation. But of course, it really depends on the site that you're testing what the meaningful business logic is in ways that it might be abused to achieve, in these examples, what's basically theft.
Sounds like borderline functional testing to me, in the sense that if you think about the job of a QA engineer, they're trying to break the system. Insufficient process validation could potentially be tested by a QA engineer who is a part of the dev test team or the DevOps team as well.
Absolutely. But it goes right back to the design discussion that we had, right? You have to have abuse cases built in that call out these flows. Otherwise, QA engineers tend to get focused on, is the application working as intended, right? Because there's this march to release where there's deadlines and there's business outcomes that are dependent upon successful releases. And so without the call outs of these sorts of abuse cases, they tend to fall through the cracks. Now, 1% of sites isn't a huge number, but given the potential meaningful business impacts that these could have, it's still, the dollar figure could be wildly disproportionate to that 1% number of sites having this type of flaw.
Right. Now, earlier on, I spoke about the SAP vulnerability. Let me kind of read out what the NVD says about that particular vulnerability before I ask you another clarifying question here, Zach. And I'm reading this out verbatim from the NVD. It says, SAP Solution Manager version 7.2, due to missing authentication checks, does not perform any authentication for a service, resulting in complete compromise of all the SMD agents connected to the Solution Manager. Now, just reading that or listening to that, Would you say that this is a case of a classic broken access control type vulnerability, or is it a case of sensitive data exposure or some other type of vulnerability?
So the interesting thing about reading into the white paper that was released about this CVE is that there are multiple flaws involved in this chain that takes you from the authentication issue all the way to complete compromise. But at its core, the entry point is that there's a sub application here that exposes some what's basically administrator functionality that had no authentication whatsoever. And so absolutely the starting point of this flaw and exploit chain was a broken access control issue.
No wonder the CVSS score for this particular CVE is 10. Zach, look, this has been a pretty deep conversation. Let me try and bubble us up for some air. I think there's a story forming here. A story about A6, which we spoke about a couple months ago, security misconfiguration. A3, which we spoke about last month, sensitive data exposure, and broken access control, A5, that we spoke about today in great detail. Almost looks like it's a trifecta, right? Combinatorially, they can have a pretty big impact from an adversary's point of view into their ability to hack into an application. I'm almost thinking that we should start treating these three vulnerabilities as a trifecta, as a bucket of vulnerabilities that we should start a campaign to vaccinate our applications against, keeping up with the theme of vaccinations, of course. What do you think? Is there a common thread here between A6, A3, and A5? Is there an opportunity that we can start treating these vulnerabilities as a trifecta, as a bucket of vulnerabilities that we want to start tracking, not just tracking, but also proactively mitigating in the applications that we see?
So in the context of the CVE that we've just been discussing, it certainly is the case that all three of these end up being involved in the exploit flow. And so I highly recommend that people that are interested take a look at that researcher's white paper to see how the misconfiguration and the sensitive data exposure all step by step led to being able to execute the complete compromise. It's not just one vulnerability, and that's interesting. What I would say is that broken access control has certainly got a lot of depth to it in terms of the permutations of the flaws that can exist. But the common thread that I think can be bundled in is that a significant proportion, like we said, at least 66% of the ones that we detect are related to issues that can be dealt with at a program level, right? And I think that's one of the key things that if you want to do this sort of vaccination program of your applications, it's looking for those types of flaws that you can eliminate or significantly reduce your risk by taking on at a program level. And so for your organization, perhaps that could be these three OWASP classes. But the other sort of counter approach that I've seen taken, and that I think is another good way, is to look at your own organization's data, right? And come up with what are your trifecta, or come up with what are your top five, and dig in and find out where the opportunities are for you to take those programmatic approaches. So maybe sort of the form that we're going through here of looking at our data, what we have at White Hat, and trying to find common threads and trying to find common approaches, maybe that form is what listeners should take away, and not necessarily the outcome of what the specific vulnerability classes are or the lens that you take, like OWASP or some other standard. Maybe get a bit specific to your organization.
Totally agree. I think the approach is equally important, as is the data. And I feel that we need to continue doing this deeper dive and trying to connect the dots between different vulnerabilities as we look at our data. And I think there's certainly an education aspect here, right? But there's also equally importantly a program aspect to it as well. How do we put together a security program that can really take all of this data as an input into the machine and drive up the security posture as an outcome for all the applications that we're running in production? And that, I think, is a good segue to the second half of today's episode. In the second half of the podcast today, I'm joined by someone who's been instrumental in shaping my thinking around application security. Now, we often seek the analytical view on issues because it's well structured, extremely summarized, and often easy to consume. But when you meet someone like Cindy Carter, my guest today, you know that having a practitioner who can help you bridge the gap between the academics, the analytical, and the real world is a game changer. And I've been a beneficiary of her expertise over the last few years. I've closely tracked her success with her approach to application security and DevSecOps at multiple organizations. And I've seen her approach work over and over again. So I'm hoping today that we dig into her approach and get a first-hand account of what it takes to implement a good application security program. Now, I also know that Cindy and I share a fandom for Simon Sinek, and I'm sure we'll be able to invoke Simon a few times during the conversation today. But look, before we get into all of that, Cindy, welcome to the podcast, and I'd love for our listeners to learn about your story, your journey. What were some of the inflection points in your career, and what were some of the choices you made to get to where you are?
Oh, well, thank you so much, Setu. It is my absolute privilege to join you today on this podcast. It has been far too long since we connected. It seems like time goes by even faster these days. And even with 2020 being the year that it was, I can't believe that's already a year behind us now when the pandemic hit. So I'm just so grateful for your mentorship as well. I'm also on the receiving end of your knowledge, your wisdom, and I'm just honored to be in your presence today. So thank you for having me on the podcast. And just like you mentioned, I think I think every security practitioner, every security leader's journey is very unique. I know some folks that found themselves in security by accident in some ways, and that may be sort of the case with me. So I'll give you a little bit of a perspective on that before we do a deeper dive into the application security practices. So when I was starting in my career very early on, I will say, I was probably about 5 years old playing on computers. And when I say playing, it's because my dad worked at IBM and he took me with him to work, and I played on the key punch machine. And I made all sorts of confetti that my mother later had to clean up when I was punching out those job cards for fun. But I was influenced by what my dad was doing. I was born and raised in the Detroit area, so here's a little social engineering for you. And his account was Ford Motor Company, so he had all of the mainframe computers that he was managing for Ford at the time. And my mom was in nursing school, so I had this sort of influence both on medicine as well as technology because I very much knew that I thought technology was cool. I could see how it was enabling companies like Ford Motor Company and others to build a better vehicle or improve operations, reduce errors, improve quality, all of those wonderful things. And then, of course, there was the medical side, which hadn't quite gotten on the technology bandwagon yet. They were still using paper charts, and my mom was going through nursing school, and she didn't have a laptop. She was, a lot of it was still pen and paper and everything. But there was a part of me that felt a calling towards medicine, mainly because of the care of the care and the protection or the betterment, I guess, of human well-being. And later in life, and I'll get to that in a moment, but later in life is where I determined how my intersection of medicine and IT came together because the IT aspect making everyone's life better by improving outcomes for whatever businesses are doing or whatever personal endeavor you have. There was a human safety aspect of that, especially once everything went online. And so there was a natural marriage between medicine and IT for me. So when I was in college, I was actually pursuing pre-med, and I had to make the decision my sophomore year whether I was going to stay the pre-med route and face 8 or more years of student loan debt and everything else on top of that, or if I was going to go ahead and stick with the technology route. And as luck would have it, I went the technology route and pursued my career from there. So as I started in IT, I was a programmer. I was a software developer, and I was writing code, changing financial systems. I had lots of different experiences in different types of organizations besides just the financial industry. I even worked at a .com startup back in the earlier days of cyber, and connected routers, pulled cable, managed engineers that were out at client sites. You name it. At a startup, you wear a lot of hats all day long, and it was fun. And that's one of the things that really kept me going and kept that thirst for knowledge, because technology, as we all know, changes so rapidly. But I also find it fun. I find it fun. I find it very fascinating. And so to fast forward through that a little bit, as I was working in some of these IT organizations, I was in a consulting company, and I just by luck began getting assigned to healthcare organizations, because now healthcare was starting to come around to getting deeper level of technology integrated. The electronic medical record was becoming a mandate, and so on and so forth. And so I found sort of this natural intersection of, well, wow, look at this. I started in pre-med, and now I'm working at a hospital, and I'm talking to chief medical information officers about how technology is going to help enable them to improve patient outcomes, and also help the hospital from a revenue cycle management and everything else along the way. So it became very natural once I moved to Kansas City, and I started working at a large healthcare IT organization in Kansas City, that I found that I was really thriving. I was my work was filled with purpose. I didn't really quite have the definition of my purpose just yet. That comes actually when I met Simon Sinek, as you mentioned, Setu, and I will talk a little bit just about that before we go into our application security ideas. So I met Simon right after he did his TED Talk in 2009, I believe it is, and that is the one that put him on the map, and it's called Start With Why. And he's a game changer in the industry, in my opinion. I'm a cult follower. I'll go ahead and admit it. But he really has not only influenced my career and some of my decisions over time, but he's also inspired me in so many ways. And his approach, the way that he looks at things, as you mentioned, Situ, has been useful and helped with the organizations that I've been at to adopt a robust application security practice. And when I peeled back the Start With Why, as he was discussing things like the on this TED Talk, he talks about Apple computers versus Dell computers. And I'm not going to spoil it for anybody out there that hasn't watched it. Please do. Go look at TED Talks, pick Simon Sinek, Sinek, and then look at Start With Why.
We'll add it to the show notes.
Oh, great. Thank you. And so as I listened to that, and I started to think about how he related that to how organizations operate, and that subtle difference there between Apple and Dell, both as computer technology companies, I started to think about that Start With Why when it came to my purpose and my why. And why am I in IT? Why am I so drawn to healthcare? And then, of course, as part of some of the work that I was doing at that healthcare organization here in Kansas City, I found myself in a rolling out an organization-wide program for solution integration, and we called it CSI. The SI was the solution integration part, and it took solutions from the minute it was a twinkle in a product manager's eye all the way to the support and life cycle management or end of life of that solution, and it included everybody in between. And when I took on that effort, it was broken. There were still a lot of silos in the organization. There was, the product, the solution management area. There was the software development area. There was the quality assurance and testing, and then support and so forth. And they weren't all connecting. They weren't all on the same page. And so it was up to me to bring these folks together to create a holistic approach to solution integration and management. And as part of that was security risk. And that is how my journey began in security.
I love it. It's kind of fascinating as you were talking to see the intersection of what you learned from your mom, the fact that you had an IT education, and the inflection point with Simon coming into your life. I think that makes for an awesome story. Now, Cindy, I know we're going to talk a lot about application security, but I still remember the first time we met in your office in Kansas City. I think almost 5 years ago. The one lasting memory I have of that day is how I actually got to your offices, got into an elevator, and actually went to the sixth floor to see you guys. Now, my experience in visiting my customers has mostly been you get into the elevator, you go to the basement, or you go to a floor that is completely cordoned off. But with your team, it was not like that. Your team was not cordoned off. There were no walls separating your team and the engineering team. And the fact that I actually took an elevator to the sixth floor, which was the engineering team's floor, if I'm not wrong, was quite a difference 5 years ago. And I think there is a message there. The message is about collaboration and making sure that security from the get go is a part of the engineering team. So, why don't you expand on that for us a little bit?
Absolutely. And thank you for that. That is a memory. I remember that day very clearly when you visited us, and it really was probably a long time coming, I think, for a lot of security teams and parts of the organization with security. To your point, we have a perception problem. We have a branding problem, I think, in security. Yes, the hoodies and hackers thing is a cool thing that folks can be drawn to because it's obscure, it's sort of mysterious and things like that, and I get it. But there are so many more facets to security, and I think that as we address the security talent shortage, some of that branding that we've had in the past, where yes, we are cordoned off in a corner. Don't talk to them. Don't wake them up unless there's something you need help with, because otherwise you might get barked at or something. I think that the days of putting baby in the corner, to quote an older movie, should be by the wayside, because security should be woven into the fabric of every organization. It should be in the corporate goals. It has to start from the top down and the bottom up, in order to truly embrace the various security aspects of the organization and how to protect the privacy and the security of not only corporate data but your intellectual property, and if you're a services organization, your clients' data, whatever your data purpose is. And it was refreshing to make sure that the team was out there front and center. We were a welcoming entity. We engaged with the folks that were in our immediate area, but we were visible within the building, even though we were located on the sixth floor. And going back just really quickly before I lose that thought, on the addressing the security talent shortage, I think that is also one of the things, as far as helping folks understand the different aspects of security that exist in an organization and how you can be part of it. I have mentored many students and folks that are either early career or even looking to make a career change that think that they may have a calling towards security. And of course, the first thing that I ask them is why? Why do you want to be in security? Because there is definitely a purpose, a purposeful will or a call to be a security practitioner. This isn't an easy job. It's not easy for anyone, and it's just the same reason that people become medical practitioners, or you've got folks on the front line in the healthcare space fighting COVID, right? Because we feel it's our purpose. It's fulfilling for us.
Yeah, let's pull on that thread a little bit, right? Because when you think about the brand of cybersecurity, you're right. It's obscurity. It's people who know a lot that you don't know about. What are some of the things in your mind that we could be doing today, right? We're in 2021, right? We're in the age of social media, where everybody's life is public. What could we be doing today better in organizations from a branding point of view? And I want to be very precise in my question as well here, because are there steps that we could take today in branding the cybersecurity teams in organizations, so that they become more approachable? What are some of the things maybe you've done in your time in cybersecurity where you've tried to not only manage the brand of cybersecurity, but also change the brand of cybersecurity in the organizations that you work for?
Sure. So there's boy, that's I'm trying to think about where to start on that one. I'll give a few examples. At one of the organizations that I was at, and this was specific to application security, by the way, specific to our topic today. And right, wrong, or indifferent, there was I won't really call it a compliance effort. It was more of we need to get FedRAMP authority to operate because we needed to do some work with the Department of Defense. And in order to do that, we had to make sure that we went through the FedRAMP process, we went through the STIGs, and we were able to demonstrate our sound application security practices and not just show a bunch of policies and procedures, but actually prove that we were scanning the code, that the code was getting addressed, any vulnerabilities in the code were getting addressed during development, and then handed over to QA for some dynamic testing, and then once again in production, and so on and so forth. We had to show that we were doing those things. And Situ, that's how you and I met. And we had to, here was the security team, right? My small application security team. And we had 3,500 developers or so globally. And they didn't want anything to do with security. We were gonna slow them down, right? They were on a 2-week sprint. They wanted to write their code, send it off, make sure that it gets bundled into the larger compilation there, and then move on to the next best thing. And again, and I understood where they were coming from because I started out my career as a software developer. So the last thing that they wanted to do was have to go back and fix someone else's code that maybe they didn't even write. So, you know what? We'll just fix that in production, right? Just write the code, send it on through. And one of the things when we had to take the approach in order to get the FedRAMP certification, well, one thing for sure, the big hammer was, well, we went ahead and ran the scan in production because what else were we going to do? We ran the scan in production and had a very colorful report, I'll just put it that way, that showed where we needed to go do some fixing. And so with that in mind, then again, we took a top-down and a bottom-up approach. We wanted to make sure that the leaders in the organization, especially in the engineering organization, understood that we were not here to call anybody's baby ugly. We were not here to slow them down. We were here to enable the organization so that they could get their FedRAMP authority to operate, and that the company would be recognized as having a stellar application security practice in place. And so this journey took 2.5 years to do. This is not an overnight exercise. When you are trying to influence the culture, whether it's a subculture in the organization, as we were inside of engineering, it you have to have a lot of patience and you have to have a lot of persistence. And once you start with those the innovators, they call it, the crazy ones that are the ones that will jump on the bandwagon with you, you start to build a little bit of momentum. You get those folks on board. You sit side by side with them, not across the table, side by side. There's a difference. And I put our software engineers side by side with their developers so that we could help them understand where the flaws were in the code, how to go fix them, how to use the product, how to use White Hat. And that, and by doing that exercise, we gained their trust. They began to trust the team when we showed up in the office instead of looking the other way or even running down the hallway in the other direction. We were welcomed. There were smiles. We were having collaborative, productive conversations around building the secure software development lifecycle. And it wasn't just within the engineering organization. Once we started building those security champions, and again, those are the folks that are going to help spread the good word. We had what we called meetups or tech talks in the organization to share publicly and publicize what it was that we were doing. And as we learned, and I will say this, I feel that software developers are sort of type A personalities, right? They love to learn new things. They are a little bit competitive, but they have this insatiable appetite for learning. What's the latest, code that you can develop with, whether, at the time it was Ruby, Python, things like that. Oh, wow, those sound really awesome. What's it like to, write something in that? And so we started to appeal to their sense of wonderment and their sense of wanting to learn more. And also, as part of the authority to operate, we had to prove that we were educating our developers. So we rolled out a 3-level program for delivering training to them for secure software development principles. We gave them the fundamentals, made sure everybody understood terminology, because we had everybody from early career to mid-career seasoned developers, but terminology is an important groundwork to lay so that everybody is speaking the same language, no pun intended, when it comes to the secure coding principles. And once they had that foundation level 1 under their belt, then they got to go to level 2 and play in the lab. And oh wow, that was like kids in a candy store, right? They were all over it. And then word spread and more champions came about. So that's one example, Situ, of how we influence the software engineering culture to embrace the effort that we needed to do in order to get that authority to operate.
Yeah, so I think that makes sense. So it also reminds me of a journey that I've been on over the last 15, 18 years of my career. I started off as a product manager. And when I got introduced to product management, it was almost like having a holier than thou kind of view of things, right? You're the product manager, you've got control. It's very similar, I think, when you're thinking about a security engineer, when they get their first job, they almost get this holier than thou kind of attitude that needs to be broken down. And what I'm hearing from you is you've got to shed that holier than thou attitude and really transform yourselves to becoming teachers, because you're going to tell people about what it means to have a security defect in the application. You need to become facilitators. That's what I heard you say when you start pulling people together in a team, sitting on the same side of the table versus sitting in front of them on the other side of the table. And then last but not the least, I think you also hit upon this whole idea of creating team events, becoming enablers, becoming the change agent around cybersecurity. I almost want to say, and I don't know if you agree with this or not, but it's almost like becoming a social media personality, right? Where you're out there, you're putting yourself out there, you're talking about the stuff you know you love and you're passionate about, but at the same time, you're also lending a helping hand to the folks in the organization so they can come to you and ask for help. Um, that's kind of the brand management and brand change that I think you're talking about in the organizations that you've been in.
Yes, absolutely. It was it was very fulfilling at the end. It was very fulfilling at the end of that 2.5 years or so. And to know that even once I left that organization, that practice and the work that we put in it still exists today, and those champions have carried that torch forward. They continue the tech talks. They continue to share their stories about what they've done using White Hat, or what they've done in their secure software development practices within their teams. So they still maintained a sense of their own personal touch on their software and how they worked, but they now were doing it securely, and they were doing it in a way that enabled the organization to obtain that authority to operate for the DoD, and then even and beyond that. So I think that's one of the super important things to remember. That journey, the time that it took to do that was an investment in patience. It was again felt sometimes like pushing a boulder uphill, but there was definitely oh, I know what I was going to think, or I was going to say. One of the things that we did not do, and this is somewhat of a game changer for some folks, we did not put up a wall of shame when the vulnerability scans were run. We knew that they had a competitive nature, but instead of putting up a wall of shame, we pulled up a wall of glory and sort of flipped the conversation, if you will. Because once you put up the wall of glory and see who's really reducing risk in their software, well, then the others want to do the same, right? There's that competitive nature. So even just little things like that can change how behavior is shaped.
Absolutely. Now, in doing so, right, there's almost always an implicit assumption that security can never go wrong. Is there an opportunity here, Cindy, just thinking about it broadly, that you also accept your failures in security? It's not always that you're going to get stuff right. Accepting failure as a part of your security operations, then seeking partnership and collaboration from other teams to kind of make up for those failures, isn't that another way of building confidence, building that collaborative muscle?
It is, and that's absolutely one of the agile principles that we embraced was fail fast. Because to your point, it is about taking those mistakes and turning them into lessons, right? So and especially when we were in the early stages of this, and we were like the deer learning to walk, right? You got to get your legs underneath you. It's going to be a little shaky at first, and you may stumble a little bit, but if you bring the humility to the equation as well. Again, we were all in it together. We did not seek to shame anyone. We were there to enable and empower. And again, when you fail, when you stumble, you fail fast, you recover, and then that enables the team to pick up and carry on. And in an agile practice, of course, you're showing incremental value sooner rather than at the end of a months long project, right? So those failures, when you do have them, aren't as what do I want to say? They're not as debilitating from or they're not as paralyzing, I guess, because you're fueled by that momentum that you already have in that agile practice and in that agile way of doing things. And when you have the failure, you fail fast, you recover, and then you're able to, like I said, turn those mistakes into lessons, and everybody's going to be okay. You have to maintain optimism and positivity, not just within the application, rolling out the application security practice, but I think anywhere in security. Security can be a pretty dark place, right? And that's again sometimes what the persona is, or the perception is, with security being this deep, dark, mysterious place. And yes, it can be. And those of us as practitioners, we don't want to dwell in the deep dark place all the time either, but that is certainly something that is on our minds between, managing threats, vulnerabilities, and risk, right? It's that I call it the love triangle. But that's something as a CISO that's always on my mind. Okay, what am I doing today to either manage or improve on any one of those three? And how can I make sure that my team and those around us that we're working with don't become so discouraged that that they give up on themselves, and that they give up on what they're doing.
That's a great segue into the approach. But before we get into the approach, I do want to make a point here around a word that you use, right? Agile or agile. I never can figure out how to say that right. But when somebody thinks about agile and DevSecOps, the first place your mind goes to is automation, automation, automation. How can I automate stuff? But I think the point you're trying to make, which I quite like, is there is a concept in agile around doing a review of where you failed, right, at the end of the agile sprint cycle. And maybe that's one place where, as security practitioners, we can start inserting ourselves, right? At the end of the sprint, could we go in and say, look, we found 14 issues, and if we had fixed just two of these issues, we would have been able to move the ball on security much farther along. So maybe that's a place where we could start, instead of focusing unnecessarily, at least initially, on automation and things that seem like big rocks. Just start thinking about going into those sprint meetings at the end of the sprint cycle and providing a perspective on how we could have done things differently.
Yes, that's called a retrospective, and it's one of my favorite parts of the whole process, actually. And just to touch on your point earlier, yes, automation, and I love automation. Automation is great. And what I was referring to, though, as you were alluding to, is the human element of that. I was referring to the process of being agile, and how, at the time that we were enabling this application security practice, how we inserted ourselves into the agile process along with them, and we were part of their daily scrum, their daily stand up meetings. We were part of those security champions meetings, and discussing various open source issues, or whatever the case may be. But we had a standing meeting around that. We also were part of the retrospectives to make sure that we look back at what we could have done better, what would we change going forward, and take those lessons learned, if you will, and move them forward, so that we can continue to improve ourselves. And one of my favorite phrases to use is called progressive elaboration, and it's an older project management term, probably in the waterfall days, but what it really embodies is, the more you know about something, the more you learn about something, especially if it's something unfamiliar to you. The more familiar you get with it, then the better you get at it, right? So think of in sports, right? If I were to just all of a sudden decide I want to take up tennis, I'm going to swing the tennis racket in all the wrong ways, right? I'm not going to be lined up right. I'm not going to have the right stance, or whatever the case may be. But with proper coaching, and with the ability to then practice, I'm going to get better at it. And that's progressive elaboration. I've learned a new skill. It's now become muscle memory. And it's sort of the same thing with what we did with application security. It became more natural to them. It became more of muscle memory for them as we integrated into their process, which is why it still carries on today.
Makes total sense, right? The whole idea that we can often get wound around the wrong axle when we think about concepts like agile and DevSecOps, our mind immediately goes to how do I automate? How do I integrate? Yes, those are worthy goals, but there are simpler things, lower hanging fruit that we can go pluck in terms of let's get inserted into the retrospective, like you said. Let's create a couple of cybersecurity champions within the organization. I think all of that makes sense. Now that's a great segue into what I think is the meat of the conversation today. You did allude to the approach that you took about getting your FedRAMP certification underway, and you said, "What the heck? Let me just start scanning in production." And that decision really proved out to be very beneficial, even from a DevSecOps perspective, from an automation perspective, because I remember that program where you were scanning stuff in production, using the insights that you have gained from scanning stuff in production and embedding it back into the software development lifecycle. That was DevSecOps enough in my perspective, from my perspective. So why don't you kind of walk us through that journey of how you convince people to scan stuff in production? What were you doing with the results you got in production? And how were you operationalizing those results? Because I think that's going to be a key takeaway for our audience today from this conversation.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, yes, we started in production with lack of anywhere else better to start, and uh, there were a few reasons behind that. Again, there was a corporate mandate for the FedRAMP certification. So, for all intents and purposes, there wasn't a lot of choice in order to implement whatever this thing called application security was. So when we had to start somewhere, right? And I think that there's quotes out there everywhere, right? The best way to begin is to start, or the best way to start is to begin, or something like that. And so we took what we had, and so we took some of the applications that were in production, and we scanned them, and we looked at the raw data. We looked at the raw reports, and we met with the leadership of those different parts of the engineering organization that were responsible for those products. And we said, okay, this is, and of course we had a partner with us doing that as well. That's yourself. And we took a look at that and said, all right, well, now we know now we know what the problem is. We know where the problems are, but how do we go ahead and start to improve the software leading up to production so that it doesn't have the bugs in it, that it doesn't have the vulnerabilities in it? What can we do to improve the quality of that code before it gets to production? So that's where the whole shift left movement started. And so, but we didn't just stop with the developers as far as that shift left went. We went beyond that. So, as I mentioned earlier, we went with product management, and when it was a twinkle in a product manager's eye, because we wanted to understand, okay, if there's going to be a new product or a new feature functionality that's going to significantly change this software, we wanted to understand the underlying architecture. We live in the show me state here in Missouri, so show me. I need to see it visually. I need to see a data flow diagram. And we got all of the folks that were part of that product involved: the product managers, the solution developers, the quality assurance testers. We got everybody in the room to talk through that, and we didn't label this at the time. We knew it was a threat modeling exercise, but we were guiding them through it so that they could understand where their product and where it fit into the architecture, and where the data flow began, where it maybe stopped, and where it picked up again, where it was stored or where it was sent off to. We looked at what kind of data was it? Was it protected health information, personally identifiable information, payment card industry, and so on and so forth? And then who had access at which points of that data? So we really mapped everything out with those particular teams. And again, this was just with one or two of those production scans, because you've got to start somewhere, right? The only way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time, they say. I've never eaten an elephant and don't intend to, because I like elephants, but I like to break things down into manageable pieces to accomplish things, and this is how we did it. So we went ahead and did those threat modeling exercises. We did the data flow mapping, and it was really amazing to see the aha moments, especially when you had maybe a software architect in the room, and then the software developer, and then the product manager. And each one of them may have had a different perception for how that product really was fitting into the overall picture, or where that data was coming from and where it was going to. Um, but that was the effort that we went through, starting in production and then going all the way back over to the left, and bringing all of those folks together through it. And that was a significant time frame effort to do that. It took several months to get through some of those, because some of the products were very complex, and very large in scale. But we let the leadership prioritize that for us, as well as where we had the highest amount of vulnerabilities and things that needed attention. So some of that decision making for where to start was given by virtue of the results that we received from the scans.
Right, right. So this approach, I'm going to kind of call it the top and tail approach to begin, right? In the sense that you've got to tail this stuff because you want to make sure that whatever's running in production, you have a very good line of sight into the vulnerabilities, so you're acting on them. That's kind of the reactive side of the approach. But then there's the preventative or the proactive side of the approach, which is you go way back to the product managers who, when they have a twinkle in their eye, they're able to start thinking about, look, I'm going to release a new feature. When I release these new features, these are the kinds of security characteristics I want this feature to have. So I do think that this top and tail approach is the right way to initiate that application security program, that DevSecOps program that you're trying to put in place. So I really like that approach. Now, one of the last things I want to talk to you about before we kind of try and summarize the conversation today is you talked about how you were able to capitalize on this broader compliance need that the organization had to drive your agenda. And a concept that I've been kind of toying around with for quite a while is what's the difference between a modern CISO 2.0, versus a traditional legacy CISO 1.0? And one of the main differences I'm finding as I speak to more CISOs is the CISO 2.0s have a lot more political and organizational acuity, right? In the sense that they're able to identify broader business needs and realign themselves to that agenda so they can actually drive the agenda they wanted to drive in the first place. In your case, it was application security. So how much weight do you attach to that, right? How much weight do you attach to the fact that you're organizationally and politically astute and observant in you becoming a successful CISO 2.0?
That's a lot to unpack there. I guess I never versioned myself before. Um, I've always believed that at the end of the day, security is a risk based conversation, and let me elaborate on that a little bit. Security traditionally, right? You alluded to this earlier. The Department of No, or maybe a bit more obscure, not really engaged or intertwined in the organization. And one of the things that I have always, even in the days of rolling out that application security practice, was that we are the department of yes, and here's how we're going to enable you to do X, Y, Z, whatever it is, in a secure fashion. And it doesn't mean that it's risk free, because there's always going to be some level of risk that with anything you do, right? Even when you get into your vehicle and drive wherever to go get your Starbucks in the morning, there's risk, right? Even though we've got airbags and cars that can drive for us almost, and seatbelts and things like that. But we're okay. We know we're good drivers. We're not texting and driving. We're paying attention to what we need to be doing, and we get there safely and we return safely. So the analogy I'm trying to make there is it's security. The way that I view it is always about enabling the business to achieve its innovation that it wants to do, or achieve its goals. Security should be a statement in the corporate goals, by the way. I always push for that in the leadership meetings, that if I read, a mission or a vision or a corporate goals launch, I always look for, where is security in here, because I need you all to have that in there in order for me to be able to do the job I need to do. This has to be a security aware organization. Another way that I empower, I guess, or embrace the CISO 2.0 is at one of the organizations I was in. I asked our human resources department about what they were doing for onboarding new employees when it came to the different things that they needed to know. Now, usually when you onboard, right, it's all about, okay, here's your benefits, here's how you log your time, or here's how you get days off scheduled and things like that. But I asked about, well, what are they learning about the security culture of this organization? Because we're all handling data, we're all hands on the keyboard and eyes on a screen, and so we're sharing information back and forth. So I need to know, how do these folks know how to keep our information safe, how to keep each other safe. And so I developed an onboarding training. And the first thing that I said to the new hires is, well, this is me. I'm Cindy Carter. These are my team members. I would introduce them. And then I said, and by the way, welcome to the security team, because all of you are part of my team now. You are the front line. You are handling email. You are processing data. You are a database administrator. You're a network administrator. You are handling the very information that this team is responsible for protecting. But I need all of your help in order to do that. And I'm going to educate you. I'm going to help you understand what it looks like to see a phishing email and what not to click on. We're going to run campaigns all year long, not just in October during National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. We're going to do all sorts of things, not only to keep it fresh, but also to keep it relevant. I call it from the living room to the boardroom. So that level of education across the organization, if it's relevant to the employees and it's relevant to the executives, and you can also marry it to what they're doing at home. Maybe they have parents that they're communicating with online, and the parent needs help with password security, or needs help making sure that their home network is set up securely and not with the default passwords on their Wi-Fi. Whatever the case may be, we're going to do everything that we can to enable you to operate securely in cyber.
Absolutely. I think the point you're trying to make, which I can completely agree with, is the CISO 2.0 is actually almost like a reverse translator, right? What they are doing is they're translating security back into business goals. Almost every other function, Cindy, I think, is a translator, right? Leadership at that level is, look, here are the 5 business goals we have, and here is how this translates to goals in my organization. But as a security leader, given the fact that security is still poorly understood, it's the CISO's job to also be the reverse translator. How do you translate security back into business goals?
Mm-hmm.
So the one thing that we've not been able to do, before I kind of summarize, is, Cindy, unfortunately, we've not invoked Simon even once in this conversation.
Yes, we did. You're going to include his link to his TED Talk.
Absolutely right. But I was also going to kind of pick your brain for a minute on this whole idea of the infinite game, right? I think cybersecurity, in particular application security, we always, shouldn't say always, but many times we look at it as a finite game. Can I fix this set of vulnerabilities and just check that box and be done with it? But one of the things that we should be thinking about when we think about cybersecurity or application security is the long term, right? How do we translate this into an infinite game? What's the just cause that we're after? Who's our worthy competitor? How are we building trusting teams? Do we have the flexibility we need to adapt to the changing or the evolving threat landscape? And are we leading in the right way? Are we leading with courage? Are we leading with empathy? So I don't know if you've had any time to think about the infinite game and how that applies to your day-to-day job.
Absolutely. I always say this to your point when you said, "Do we just check the box and move on?" I don't subscribe to that. Security is never done. That's why you may have heard me use the word practice a lot. And by practice I don't mean like a fee for service. What I mean is a practice is ongoing. Think about a medical practices, right? New viruses are coming about all the time, and we're trying to find cures and vaccines and things like that. Cures for cancer, vaccines for COVID. It's an ongoing exercise because new viruses are going to come up all the time. The germs are going to mutate some other way, right? Think of a legal practice and their interpretation of the law and how the law may apply differently in different cases. I'm sure every attorney out there can argue both sides of every case. And so I think of security in the same way as a practice and not a program. A program is a group of projects, and a project has a definitive start and end date. So that's why I use the term practice when I said application security practice or security practice overall, because we always are faced with new vulnerabilities, new gaps in our security posture, new technologies, new innovation, new ways of doing things, and new threats. Threat intelligence, as you know, is becoming even more and more popular these days too, and there's a reason for that. The more informed you are about the actions that you're about to take, then the better your chances of increasing, your success, your successful outcome. So that's one of the ways that I look to security. Is security is a practice. It's never done.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Cindy, this has been a fascinating 40 plus minutes. Let me try and kind of summarize some of the key highlights that we hit upon in our conversation. The first one that really resonated with me was this idea of what's your brand, right? Sometimes we often say that, look, let our work speak for ourselves, but in the case of security, it's not a bad idea to get ahead of the game a little bit, get ahead of the eight ball a little bit, and put yourself out there as security practitioners and talk about the work that you do and how you can be helpful. So brand management was one of the highlights of the conversation for me. The second one was this whole concept of agile and how we equate agile and DevSecOps to first thing we have to do is automation. We probably need to rethink that and start thinking about in the agile process, in the DevSecOps process, what are the key inflection points where we can insert ourselves as security professionals? And one key area that you highlighted was the retrospective. Can we show up at the retrospective with data, with the right kind of data, and motivate the agile team, the product team to look at security more closely? The third thing, which I think was kind of the meat of the conversation, was this whole top and tail approach to implementing a cybersecurity and an application security practice. To your point, let's look at what's happening in production. Let's reduce the risk of being breached in production. And then let's also go all the way back, not just to development, but also to product management and start thinking about what are some of the preventative measures we need to take from a software development point of view. The fourth thing that I want to highlight from our conversation was this whole idea of becoming the reverse translator. Almost every other function in the business is translating business goals to functional goals. And I think hopefully you agree, one of the main jobs of the Chief Information Security Officer or security leader going forward is how do we translate security goals back into business goals? Because I think that's the rubric, the reverse rubric that's been missing for the longest period. And last but not the least, I have to say this, the infinite game mindset, right? And I think you summarized it really well. Don't think about application security as a project or a program. It's actually a practice that is going to live long in the organization even after you've actually moved on. So those are my 5 key takeaways. Anything that I missed or you'd like to add, Cindi?
No, I think you encapsulated it very well.
Perfect. On that note, great talking to you. Always a fun conversation. Stay safe, and I'm sure we'll talk again. Thank you so much, Cindi.
Thank you, Setu, and thank you, team. It's been wonderful to join you today, and I look forward to seeing everybody someday soon at a conference in person.
Absolutely. On that note, a huge thank you to the production team. Herman and Lauren, you make this really easy to do. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you for listening to White Hat Security's AppSec Stats Flash podcast. To learn more, download the report or visit us on the web at www.whitehatsec.com.